Hi everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at a new lens from Brightin Star. It's their 50mm f1.4 autofocus APS-C lens for Sony cameras, and it will be coming out in the Nikon Z and Fujifilm X mounts. Brightin Star sent this lens out to me at no cost to myself, but this is not a paid or sponsored review, and as always I'll give you my honest and fair opinion. So being a 50mm APS-C lens, this will give you an equivalent full-frame field of view of a 75mm lens, making this basically a short telephoto, which is very popular for doing portraits, but I've even seen this used for doing landscapes and street photography. And this is an f1.4, meaning it's a very fast lens, so you can use this in low light with faster shutter speeds and or lower ISOs, and also you can get a very nice shallow depth of field if you want it. So as you're probably already aware, either through reviews you've seen on my channel or others, there's a lot of budget autofocus primes coming out in this particular focal length, say between 50 and 56 millimeters. And the apertures generally run between like f1.8 and 2.8, and prices tend to range between say $150 and $300. And this lens sits on the higher end of that range at $249, but is still certainly very affordable. So before we go into my standard lens review montage where we talk about the optical characteristics and test charts and sample images, I wanted to give you my first impression of this lens and talk about why I think the pricing being at the higher end of that budget range is justified. So first of all, it is the build quality. It really feels premium. I mean, I'd put it right up there with my Zeiss 55mm f1.8, and that lens costs 4 times as much. Secondly, it's just the way this lens renders images, and I understand this is very subjective, but I just love the colors I'm getting from this lens. The micro contrast, the transition from what's in focus to out of focus, the way it renders the speculars and the bokeh. I mean, it's just something very natural and organic about it, something you really don't see a lot of in the clinical perfection of modern lenses today. Now, another thing that impressed me about this lens was its flaring and ghosting performance. Now, a lot of the lenses I've tested is sort of in this budget price range. The flaring and ghosting was just awful, and you had to kind of learn to use that defect creatively in your photos. But with this lens, you could shoot with a lot of highlights and speculars in your image, and it still maintains very good contrast in the shadows and the midtones, and you really didn't have any ghosting at all. But of course, if you shoot directly into the sun, you will start to lose some contrast, but overall the performance is really much better than any other lens I've tested in this price range. Also remember, this is an f1.4 lens. Most of the autofocus lenses I've tested up to this point have been f1.8s. So you're getting a full 2/3 more stop light reaching the sensor, thereby letting you use lower ISOs, faster shutter speeds, and getting a shallower depth of field. So ultimately you should get better image quality. And then one last thing I want to mention, and this is kind of a technical detail, but the front element has a fluorine coating on it, and this is something I've never seen on a budget lens before. And basically what a fluorine coating is sort of a protection for the front element, so it makes it more resistant to stains and dust and anything sticking to the lens, so that if you do get any smudges or stains on the front of the lens, they are easily wiped off without affecting the optical performance. So my first impressions of this lens are very good, and I think the $249 price point is justified, and actually this lens is an extremely good value. But with that said, there's always going to be some compromises when we're talking about budget lenses, and not everything is rainbows and butterflies. So let's get into the fine print and take a closer look at the build quality and the optical characteristics of this lens, and then I'll give you the final word. So as I mentioned before, I really like the build quality of this lens. It's nice all metal and glass construction. The focusing ring is extremely well dampened and very smooth. I had no problems with focusing manually. The lens doesn't have any function buttons or an aperture ring, but that's not really a big deal. And there's a USB-C port here for upgrading the firmware, and I really like the gunmetal finish of the metal lens mount. Now the lens hood itself is plastic, but it does have a locking mechanism on it, which I really like, so it won't come off unless you push that button again to release it from the lens. Now looking at the technical specifications of this lens, you can see we have 12 elements and 8 groups, and this is a relatively sophisticated design, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. And then the aperture, of course, is 1.4 to f16 with 9 aperture blades, and we have a minimum focusing distance of 1/2 meter. The filter thread being at 58 millimeters is pretty standard, but look at the weight here at 450 grams. Now, as far as budget lenses go in general, this is a little bit on the heavier side, and I attribute that to the overall build quality being very good. But in addition to that, remember this is an f1.4 lens. So when you look at it from that perspective, this lens is actually about right or even a little bit on the lighter side compared to other f1.4 lenses. Now taking a look at the MTF chart, you kind of have to take these with a grain of salt because these are not generated by actually physically testing the lens. They are generated in software based on the lens design. And there's really three things I look for when I look at an MTF chart. Which line represents the maximum line pairs per millimeter? And in this case, it's 30 line pairs per millimeter, or this red line. And then the second thing I look at is how does this line fall on the chart? Meaning how high is it along the y-axis or optical transfer function, where we're talking basically about the contrast or frequency or sharpness. And then how does it fall off, or where does it start to fall off along the x-axis, which represents from the center of the sensor out to the corners. And then finally, I don't like any part of that line to fall below 0.5 because that's where you will start to see some significant loss in detail and sharpness. And what I see here is actually fairly representative of the images I was getting from this lens, where it was very, very sharp across the frame until you got to the last 10 or 15% of the edges, and even then it really wasn't that bad. I tested this lens on my Sony a7R5 in APS-C mode, so I'm getting effectively 26 megapixels. And as you can see at f1.4 and f2, the corners are a little bit soft, although they do start to improve at f2, f2.8, and at f4 they're not bad, and really at f5.6 we have really good sharpness. Now, what's really nice about this lens is it has extremely good contrast across the entire frame, regardless of aperture. And at f8, I think everything is pretty much tack sharp. But even at f16, when diffraction is supposed to set in, because the contrast is so good, we're getting a very high perceived sharpness out of this lens. Now, in addition to the ghosting and flaring, another area that this lens really excels at is in the purple fringing and chromatic aberrations. In my real-world testing, I just was not seeing any. And even if I did see a little tiny bit there, they're extremely easy to fix in post-processing. Now in the test charts and in that last image, you may have noticed some mild vignetting at f1.4, even at f2, but at f2.8 it's completely gone. Now when it comes to the distortion, this lens was perfect. I didn't have to dial in any distortion correction at all. Lines were perfectly straight, horizontally and vertically. So if you're thinking about using this lens for architecture, you won't have any problems there. Now when it comes to autofocus, the lens uses a stepping motor and it moves just a single piece of glass inside the lens. So the focus was very fast and accurate, as much as can be when I was doing an AFS mode. And then when I switched to AFC mode, you can see again, the lens focused very quickly from point A to point B. I also found the lens to work very well with the subject detect, in this case animal detect, but it also worked very well for the human face and eye detect. I didn't have any problems with the performance of the lens in terms of autofocusing. And the same held true when I was doing continuous autofocus in video mode. The lens was easily able to keep up with me as I moved back and forth, in and out of the frame. The lens has a little bit of focus breathing, as you can see here, but generally speaking, I was very happy with the video autofocus performance. So here I'm testing the minimum focusing distance of this lens, and as you can see with this normal size flower, I can't quite fill the frame, but I can get close enough where I can get still plenty of details in the stems and the petals, and you still get this very beautiful background blur. And of course, if you do want to extract and see more detail, really all you need to do is just crop in a little like I did on this image. Now for this sequence here, I'm looking at the background blur and the speculars and seeing how this lens renders the out of focus areas, and I think it's doing a beautiful job. It's very smooth and creamy, stepping from f1.4 all the way to f16. And then when I move to the minimum focusing distance so you can actually see the bokeh balls and the speculars, again, I think it's doing a really good job. They look very round, although you can see a little bit of the edges, but really, the bokeh in the background is not busy at all, and I think the lens is doing a very good job here as well. Now coming back to this image here, which I shot at f1.4, I want you to look at the bokeh ball just above the bird's head. You'll notice that there's no soap bubble effect and there's no onion ringing. And this can be attributed to the optical design of this lens. Specifically, they didn't use any spherical glass, which gives you sort of that signature onion ringing effect that you see in so many other lenses that do use a spherical glass. And they've also added those corrective elements, which minimizes or eliminates that soap bubble effect that you see in so many lenses that use maybe only 6 elements. And you see this a lot also in vintage lenses that only use 3 or 4 elements. And some people like that effect, but in this lens design, they decided to minimize that and give you the smoothest, creamiest bokeh possible. So overall, I think the background and bokeh performance is pretty impressive, as well as the other optical characteristics like chromatic aberration is minimal, if non-existent. The ghosting and flaring performance is very good, and the lens is very sharp, wide open in the center, all the way up to f/16. It has excellent contrast. I love the colors. Really, the only place this lens falls down is when you're shooting at, say, f4 and wider, say all the way down to f1.4. The corners are soft, and on a lens like this, I don't consider that a deal breaker, mainly because, you know, if you're shooting wide open or at wider apertures, your subject is going to be in the center, and the outside or around that subject is going to be out of focus anyway because of the very shallow depth of field. And in real life, we're not shooting test charts and brick walls. We're shooting three-dimensional objects. And situations where that is going to be a problem are going to be pretty minimal. Now, if you're doing landscapes, you do want to pay attention to your aperture and make sure you're at f5.6 or f8, which is, you know, recommended anyway when you're doing landscape photos, so that you do get that corner-to-corner sharpness and that very deep depth of field. Now, one other area of compromise for this lens, and I think this is to be expected, this is not a sports action lens. Now, while the stepping motors and the autofocus were able to keep up when I was, say, doing point A to point B, whether I was in single or continuous autofocus, I took this lens out to the dog park where the animals are kind of running all over the place back and forth, and I had a lot of shots out of focus. The stepping motors were just not able to keep up with that kind of action. So I don't think that should be a deal breaker when you're looking at a lens like this, but I did want to share that with you. So this is the second lens I've reviewed for Brightin Star, and again, I'm very impressed with what they've done here. And I think this is their first autofocus lens, and they've done a great job. So if you're looking for a 50mm f1.4 portrait lens for your APS-C Sony, Nikon Z, or Fujifilm, I don't think you'll be disappointed. I think this lens offers a terrific value at $249. I'll have my affiliate links down below if you're interested. That helps support the channel. But that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.